The engines hummed steadily as Flight 782 climbed into the thin Colorado air. Afternoon sunlight splashed across the fuselage, creating a deceptive sense of calm. Inside the cabin, a tapestry of ordinary lives unfolded. Some passengers scrolled endlessly on their devices, earbuds plugged in, lost in music or podcasts. Others tried to steal sleep in the cramped seats, heads leaning against windows streaked with condensation. Overhead, the flight attendants moved quietly, distributing drinks and reassuring passengers with smiles that had been practiced 1,000 times. Among them, Emily Carter glided along the aisle with a grace that seemed casual, but her mind was far from relaxed. To the casual eye, she was just another crew member, blonde hair pinned neatly, uniform crisp, name tag shining. But behind the professional facade, Emily's eyes scanned every movement, every flicker of body language, every nervous twitch. Years in the Navy had trained her to read tension, to notice small anomalies, to anticipate danger before it arrived. And now she felt it, a subtle but unmistakable tension in the air. It started small. A man in 14C kept shifting in his seat, tapping a finger rhythmically against the armrest. Another passenger in 22D constantly checked the overhead bin, as though hiding something or ensuring something wasn't being noticed. Emily noticed, cataloged, but remained outwardly calm. Flight attendants are trained to be invisible observers, but Emily had learned the hard way that observation was often the difference between life and death. She paused at the galley to straighten cups and napkins, her eyes flicking toward the restroom door. It had been occupied for an unusually long time, too long, too quiet. A whisper of movement, metallic against porcelain. Emily's gut tightened. Something was off. She had learned to trust instinct. Years of flying combat missions, each more unpredictable than the last, had taught her that when your instincts screamed, you listened. Then the cockpit call light blinked. A single pulse at first, almost imperceptible, then two, then three. Emily stiffened. That signal was never routine. She moved deliberately toward the intercom, fingers hovering ready to speak, when the plane suddenly lurched, a violent jerk that sent drinks spilling and overhead compartments rattling. Oxygen masks dangled, briefly dropping before springing back, mocking the terrified screams of passengers. Panic rippled through the cabin like a shockwave. Adults clutched children who screamed and cried, confusion reflected in every wide eye. Overhead, the seatbelt sign flashed red, though no weather could explain the sudden turbulence. And from the cockpit came a voice, low, commanding, foreign to the passengers. Calm, terrifying, deliberate. Everyone remained seated. This aircraft is now under new management. The cabin froze. Time seemed to stretch. Every mind raced. Emily, however, did not flinch. Years of high-stress combat missions had honed her ability to act when chaos erupted. She smiled subtly, not for the hijackers, but for herself. They had no idea that the person standing calmly among their terrified hostages had the skills, the instincts, and the courage to neutralize the threat. Emily's gaze swept the cabin. In row 14, the nervous man's hand trembled over the armrest. In row 22, the other man's knuckles whitened around the strap of his bag. Their fear, palpable, confirmed her suspicion. These were not ordinary criminals. They had a plan, and it was ruthless. But she had plans of her own, ones they couldn't anticipate. Passengers whispered frantically to each other. A mother tried to calm her crying child. An elderly man muttered prayers under his breath. Emily's voice, soft but firm, cut through the chaos. "Please remain calm. Stay seated. Help is on the way." Her words were designed not to reassure passengers, she knew better, but to buy her time to maintain order while calculating the next move. Every movement mattered now. Every sound, every shift of weight in the cabin could give away intentions, could be the first clue of who was armed, who posed the real threat. Emily noted how the hijackers moved, subtle patterns in the way they shifted weight from foot to foot, the slight glances over shoulders. They were trained, yes, but she was better. She had flown jets where survival depended on noticing the subtlest cues. She had been in firefights where hesitation meant death. A flight attendant nearby fumbled with a beverage cart, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Emily intervened silently, gently but firmly guiding her away from the aisle. "Go to the jump seat. Don't argue," she whispered. The attendant complied, terrified, leaving Emily free to focus on the threats at the front of the plane. Then came a sound that froze her heart, a metallic scrape from the rear of the cabin. Small, almost inaudible over the hum of engines and panic. Emily's head snapped toward the source. A restroom door slightly ajar. She recognized the pattern. She had seen it countless times in combat, preparation, concealment, tension before an attack. Whoever or whatever was behind that door, they were readying for something. Emily's mind raced. She mentally ran through the plan she had formulated in the milliseconds since the first lurch: assess, isolate, neutralize. Her fingers brushed the intercom again. She considered communicating with the cockpit, but the voice she had heard before made her hesitate. No, not yet. Timing was everything. She glanced at the cabin's exit row. A mother clutched her child, whispering prayers that mixed with terrified sobs. Across the aisle, a businessman muttered under his breath, attempting to maintain composure. Emily's eyes lingered on them, assessing, protecting. Her training had never let her forget the human element, even in war, even in chaos. Civilians mattered. Lives mattered. And right now, she was the only thing standing between them and catastrophe. The plane dipped slightly, more violently than any normal turbulence would warrant. Gasps filled the cabin. Some passengers cried openly. Emily's jaw set. The hijackers were asserting control, but she had already begun asserting her own in ways they would never anticipate. Her hand brushed the cart handle, testing the weight, the possibility. Subtle adjustments could create opportunities, small but decisive advantages. And then, almost imperceptibly, the cockpit call light blinked again. 3 pulses. Emily's eyes narrowed. That signal confirmed her worst suspicion. The cockpit was compromised. The person behind that voice had the authority now. And the passengers, oblivious to the danger, sat trapped, unaware of the ticking clock counting down to disaster. Emily exhaled slowly, masking the tension coiling in her stomach. She had been in high-risk scenarios before: engine failures, emergency landings, hostile fire, but this was different. There were civilians, families, strangers, all counting on her. And yet she knew something that no one else did. She was not just a flight attendant. She was a trained combat pilot, decorated, experienced, a survivor. And now, she was the only line of defense between the hijackers and 164 innocent lives. As the plane leveled again, engines humming, Emily adjusted her posture, her uniform perfect, her face calm. Around her, passengers whispered in fear. Children clutched toys and blankets, unaware that the person walking past them, smiling reassuringly, could in minutes decide the fate of everyone aboard. The hijackers believed they were in control. Emily knew better. And as she moved down the aisle, her eyes locked on the first sign of movement from the aggressors. She whispered to herself, almost inaudibly, "They have no idea who they just hijacked a plane with." And at that moment, everything changed. The plane tilted slightly again, and the first real scream echoed from the front of the cabin. The hijacking had begun. The initial lurch of Flight 782 had been a warning. Now the plane leveled, but the tension in the cabin had transformed into raw, palpable fear. Screams and whispered prayers filled the confined space as passengers clutched arms, blankets, and children. Some slid their hands into pockets, hopping desperately that no one noticed their nervous movements. Emily Carter moved down the aisle with deliberate calm, hands raised, her eyes scanning every face, every subtle twitch. She had seen this kind of fear before. It was predictable, manipulable, but the danger wasn't from panic, it was from the ones orchestrating it. 2 men suddenly rose from their seats, breaking the fragile rhythm of terror. One in the front, tall, lean, his suit jacket concealing the unmistakable outline of a pistol. The second in the rear, stockier, with a hardened face and eyes that didn't flicker in fear, also armed. Emily froze in place for a split second, not from shock but to observe, to analyze. Their movements were precise, practiced, military-trained. This wasn't a random crime. This was coordinated. The rear hijacker fired a single round into the ceiling. The echo reverberated through the cabin like a crack of thunder, sending overhead bins rattling and a fresh wave of screams washing over the passengers. Some dropped to the floor instinctively, others clutched each other in desperate hugs. Emily's heart rate remained steady. Training, she reminded herself. Training keeps you alive. "Sit down," the stocky hijacker bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos. Fear gripped the cabin, but Emily kept moving, subtly guiding passengers to comply while calculating her next moves. She noticed the smallest details, the glint of sweat on a forehead, the slight quiver of fingers on a weapon, the misalignment of a pistol grip in a tense hand. These were weaknesses, small but exploitable. The front hijacker grabbed a young flight attendant, shoving her violently aside. She stumbled, nearly falling to the aisle carpet. Emily was immediately there, catching her gently by the arm and whispering, "You're okay. Go to the jump seat, don't argue." The attendant, wide-eyed and trembling, nodded and obeyed. Emily's calm, authoritative tone had the uncanny effect of pausing even the armed aggressors for a fraction of a second, a fraction that could be decisive. Emily's eyes flicked back toward the cockpit. The reinforced door was still sealed, the small security window reflecting nothing but fear and fluorescent cabin lights. Her mind raced. This wasn't about money or random terror. Whoever had taken control of that cockpit was targeting something, someone, something strategic, and the methodical nature of their movements confirmed it. She crouched slightly to steady herself, brushing the edge of a service cart with her fingertips, assessing weight and momentum. A single, well-placed nudge could become a tool or a weapon. Her fingers flexed, remembering the muscle memory ingrained from years of combat. She had landed jets on damaged carriers at night. She had pulled fellow pilots from burning aircraft, seen the bodies of comrades torn apart by failure. Civilians terrified on a commercial flight. This was a different battlefield, yes, but the stakes were no less lethal. A middle-aged man in row 11 whispered frantically to his wife, "They're not going to let us live." His words hung in the cabin like smoke. Emily moved past them, her voice low but steady. "Please remain calm. Follow instructions. No one has to get hurt." She wasn't trying to reassure them. She was buying time. Every second, every movement mattered. From the rear came a subtle metallic scrape, the kind that made her nerves tingle. Emily's gaze snapped toward the restroom door, still occupied, still too quiet. Her instincts screamed that something or someone was readying an attack. She could see the tension coiling in the hijacker's posture, ready to respond to any movement. Then came the first real confirmation of the hijacker's lethal intent. The front hijacker barked at a young man who had dared to reach for the overhead bin. The gun came up. The man froze, hands raised instinctively, eyes wide in terror. Emily noticed the slight tremor in the hijacker's grip, a micro-expression that betrayed overconfidence rather than skill. She filed it away. Overconfidence could be deadly. The plane lurched again, this time deliberately, as the hijackers manipulated the controls from the cockpit. The oxygen masks dropped briefly, causing a wave of screaming. A mother clutched her baby so tightly that the child's cries grew louder. Emily approached, kneeling down to soothe the child, using a gentle touch and quiet words to anchor the woman's panic. While passengers' focus was on their own terror, Emily's mind worked furiously. She was cataloging exits, counting armed aggressors, calculating distances. Each detail could be a lever. A sudden announcement through the intercom from the cockpit sent chills down her spine. "We are diverting this aircraft. Any interference will be met with lethal force." The tone was cold, unwavering, the voice of someone who had trained others to obey and feared nothing. Emily's fingers brushed the cart again, testing weight and center of gravity. Subtle shifts could redirect momentum in the narrow aisle. She flexed her wrists quietly under the uniform, remembering the precision and control of piloting an FA-18. Every second mattered. Every reaction could prevent the next shot, the next scream. Her thoughts flickered briefly to her past: missions flown at night, engines failing midair, fellow pilots depending on her instincts to survive. She had left the Navy quietly, but the skills never left her. She had lived through situations that ordinary people couldn't imagine, and now here, trapped at 30,000 feet with armed hijackers and terrified civilians, those skills were all that stood between chaos and survival. Another sound from the rear: the restroom door creaked. A shadow moved inside. Emily's gaze locked on it. She adjusted her stance subtly, keeping calm, pretending to arrange napkins while mentally preparing for whatever would emerge. The flight attendants who had huddled in the jump seats watched her. Emily caught their eyes, nodded slightly, conveying without words, "Stay calm. Observe. Wait for the right moment." Their fear was raw, infectious, but manageable. Leadership, she reminded herself, often comes in silent gestures, not loud commands. From the cockpit, muffled shouts now accompanied the mechanical sounds of flight. Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. She knew the hijackers were adjusting altitude, banking the plane to intimidate and destabilize. Her heart remained calm, her breaths measured. Patience was critical. Premature action would cost lives. A child screamed, tearing Emily briefly from her calculations. She crouched, held the small body, whispered reassurances, and placed the child back in the mother's arms. Then she straightened. Every passenger she stabilized, every small reassurance she provided, was a thread in a web of control she alone could maintain until she struck. Finally, she allowed herself a small inward smile. The first pulse of panic among the hijackers had begun: their overconfidence, the slight misalignment in their posture, the hesitation before taking control of the cabin. These were openings. And then came the final signal, almost imperceptible. A subtle misstep by the rear hijacker, a fumbled gun strap, a glance over the shoulder, the first crack in their armor. Emily's eyes narrowed. She could feel the moment approaching, the pivot when control could shift. And she knew, when it came, she would act decisively, without hesitation. Her voice remained calm as she whispered to a flight attendant beside her, "Get ready. Observe everything. No sudden moves until I signal." The passengers, still unaware of who Emily really was, clutched each other, eyes wide with terror. The hijackers believed they were in command, unaware that a decorated combat pilot walked among them, analyzing every detail, preparing for the moment to turn the tables. The plane tilted slightly again, the cabin lights flickered, and Emily's gaze locked on the cockpit door. She whispered to herself, just enough for her own ears, "It's time." And in that moment the stage was set. Every movement, every breath, every calculated decision that followed could determine who lived and who didn't. Emily Carter's calm exterior belied a storm of calculations racing through her mind. The plane had leveled, but the turbulence, both literal and emotional, persisted. Passengers whispered prayers and clutched loved ones, unaware that the most dangerous person on the plane was walking among them, disguised in polyester and a badge. She moved like a phantom down the aisle, every gesture casual, every step precise, as she catalogued weapons, stances, and spacing. She wasn't just a flight attendant. She was a former combat pilot, a decorated Navy officer who had flown FA-18s off aircraft carriers at night, landed crippled jets with failing hydraulics, and survived firefights where hesitation meant death. 8 years ago, she had been Captain Emily Carter, call sign Valkyrie, decorated with bronze stars and commendations that remained classified. She had left the service quietly, carrying memories most people couldn't imagine. Memories of pilots lost in midair, of engines screaming, of moments when every decision was a choice between life and death. Commercial aviation was supposed to be simple, predictable, safe. But as the hijackers manipulated the controls, forcing sudden dives and climbs, Emily felt the familiar tightening of the gut, the adrenaline spike that told her danger was close, that the ordinary world had collapsed into a battlefield. This wasn't random. These weren't amateurs. They had a goal, and it wasn't money, political, strategic, Or worse. Emily's eyes scanned the aisle again. A mother held her child so tightly the baby's cries had become almost musical, a desperate wail that echoed across the cabin. An elderly man clutched his rosary beads, murmuring prayers in a quivering voice. A teenager shook, earbuds dangling from his ears, frozen by terror. Each of them depended on her, whether they knew it or not. From the cockpit, muffled voices shouted instructions. The hijackers were skilled, precise, and dangerous. They had gained control of the aircraft's trajectory, pushing it to extremes designed to terrify. Emily crouched slightly, moving through the rows with her hands brushing the carts and overhead bins. Each small adjustment, each subtle nudge, was an experiment, a test of opportunity. One wrong move by her could cost lives, but one right move could turn the tide. Her mind drifted briefly to the missions she had flown years ago, missions she never spoke of. She remembered the deafening roar of jet engines over hostile territory, the adrenaline rush of pulling a co-pilot from a burning cockpit, the smell of smoke and hydraulic fluid mixing in a lethal cocktail. She had survived impossible situations. She had watched others perish. And she had learned that survival wasn't about courage alone. It was about patience, calculation, and precise timing. The rear hijacker shifted, distracted by a passenger refusing to comply with a seating order. Emily's eyes caught the subtle movement, the fraction of a second hesitation. It was enough. She flexed her fingers under her uniform sleeves, feeling the muscles remember years of precision maneuvers. She could disarm him if she chose. She could neutralize the threat, but she needed timing, perfect timing. A child screamed nearby. Emily's voice, calm and melodic, cut through the panic. "It's okay, sweetheart, mommy's right here. Nothing will happen." She crouched, held the child gently, and then handed him back. A mother's grateful tear met her eyes, but Emily did not let herself feel triumph. Victory, she reminded herself, was coming, but it was not yet. Then the unmistakable signal of danger. The cockpit light blinked 3 times, urgent and deliberate. Emily stiffened. The cockpit was compromised. Someone in there was coordinating the hijack, directing the turbulence, ensuring the passengers were terrified. But they had made a critical mistake. They assumed no one aboard had combat experience. They had no idea that the woman walking down the aisle, smiling and calm, could neutralize threats and take control. Emily shifted slightly, pretending to adjust the cart in the galley. Her eyes met those of the stocky rear hijacker who was checking passengers, assessing threats, maintaining control. Their eyes locked for a fleeting second. The subtle narrowing of his gaze, the tightening of his jaw, he sensed something, but he didn't know what. He had no idea. She whispered under her breath, "They have no idea who they're dealing with." Memories of her past missions surged briefly. Nights spent flying in near-zero visibility, relying on instinct and split-second calculations. Emergencies with engines failing, systems failing, and lives depending entirely on her. The weight of responsibility had been enormous then, and it was enormous now. Only now, instead of a cockpit full of trained personnel, the lives she held in her hands were civilians, people with no training, no weapons, no defenses. Her gaze moved to the front of the cabin. The passengers were frozen, wide-eyed, some sobbing silently, others clinging desperately to loved ones. Emily's calm presence was their anchor, though they didn't realize it. She walked past the young flight attendants in the jump seats, whispering reassurance, guiding them subtly to avoid panic. "Observe, don't react, stay quiet," she mouthed. Their eyes filled with terror, but they nodded. Suddenly, the rear hijacker turned sharply, reacting to a subtle movement from one of the passengers. Emily had anticipated this. She shifted slightly, her hands brushing the metal of the service cart. A minor adjustment, but enough to throw off the hijacker's balance by a fraction of a second. He stumbled, just enough for her to register a potential opening. The cockpit door rattled. The voice from inside barked orders. Emily froze mid-step, assessing the sound, the timing. Every syllable, every inflection, told her more about their confidence and their weaknesses. These men were dangerous but predictable. She knew exactly what to do if the moment presented itself. The plane lurched again. the engine straining as if warning of the physical limits being tested. Emily steadied herself against the aisle seat, her mind running multiple simulations simultaneously. The position of the hijackers, the layout of the cabin, the weight of carts, the best angles for intervention. Her muscles remembered movements she had not used in years: flips, grabs, disarms, restrains. Every skill she had honed in the military was at her fingertips, ready. From the rear, a metallic scraping sound indicated that the restroom door had opened. Emily's eyes narrowed. She crouched slightly, aligning her stance. Every instinct screamed at her: observe, calculate, act only when opportunity presents itself. Her heart rate remained steady, her breathing controlled. She had survived far worse in far less controlled environments. Then came the sound she had feared most: muffled shouting from the cockpit, followed by a gunshot. Panic erupted, even among the seasoned flight attendants. The passengers screamed, some throwing themselves into the aisle. Emily's eyes flicked to the source. She made a split-second decision, moving toward the aisle center with her hands raised, appearing passive while calculating the exact moment to strike. The rear hijacker glanced at her, suspicion flickering across his face. Emily smiled slightly, keeping her calm mask in place. He had no idea she was a decorated combat pilot. He didn't know that the woman in the polyester uniform could, in seconds, neutralize both him and his partner, regain control of the cabin, and save every life on board. Her breath came slowly, controlled, as she whispered, "Soon, very soon." The passengers clutched each other, screaming and praying, while Emily's mind ran faster than ever. Timing, precision, patience. The elements that had kept her alive in combat missions now controlled the fate of everyone on Flight 782. And as the plane dipped slightly once again, the first real confrontation was only moments away. Emily Carter's past had prepared her for this. Her instincts, her training, her experience, all of it pointed to one unavoidable truth: the hijackers had underestimated her, and soon they would pay the price. The countdown had begun. The cabin was a controlled storm of fear. Passengers clutched arms, blankets, children, and each other. The rear hijacker's eyes flicked toward a young man refusing to stay in his seat. His hand twitched toward the gun, and Emily's gaze locked on the micro-movement, recognizing the subtle tell of overconfidence in an untested aggressor. She smiled faintly under her mask of calm. Emily stepped lightly toward the galley, hands raised in the universal gesture of harmlessness, her voice soft, almost coaxing. "Sir," she said quietly, "the passenger in 18B is diabetic. He needs insulin from his bag. Please allow me a moment." The rear hijacker's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to negotiation from someone he assumed powerless. He hesitated, a critical error. Emily continued slowly, deliberately, inching closer to the aisle cart. Every fraction of a second counted. The cart was her first tool, slightly shifted, just enough to roll toward the hijacker's feet with precise timing. The weight caught him off guard, sending his knee snapping backward as he stumbled. Emily twisted her wrist instinctively, keeping her hands near her body, ready to react. The gun fired into the floor with a deafening crack. Sparks flew from the carpet. Passengers screamed. The cabin became a blur of panic and terror. Emily's heart rate remained steady. Her mind, however, was in overdrive, calculating trajectories, timing, angles, and the human response curves of every person in the aisle. The front hijacker turned abruptly, gun rising, eyes wide. Emily's hand had already found the leverage on his wrist. The motion was fluid, trained, instinctive. She used his momentum against him, twisting and pulling, forcing him off balance. In the narrow aisle there was no room for error. Each move had to be perfect. Metal clanged. The overhead bins rattled. A passenger screamed as a cup flew across the cabin. Emily didn't flinch. Her muscles remembered every movement from the countless combat drills she had endured. She had disarmed multiple threats in seconds before. This was no different, except the stakes were higher. Every civilian life amplified the pressure, but it also sharpened her focus. The rear hijacker tried to recover, but Emily anticipated his movement. Her elbow drove into his ribs and he fell to the aisle carpet, the gun skidding across the floor. He groaned in pain, but there was no time to linger. The front hijacker, recovering from Emily's strike, attempted to raise the gun again. Emily grabbed his wrist mid-motion, spinning him violently into the narrow space between the aisle and seat row. The gun clattered uselessly to the floor. For a moment, time slowed. She had the upper hand, but only briefly. "Everyone stay down," she barked through the chaos. Her voice cut through screams like steel. Passengers ducked instinctively. Some were crying openly, others stared wide-eyed, frozen in disbelief. Emily didn't look at them. She couldn't. Her attention was fully on the two hijackers, calculating her next move, every instinct firing simultaneously. The cabin lurched violently as the cockpit pushed the plane into another aggressive maneuver. Gravity shifted, passengers slammed into seatbacks, and oxygen masks dangled awkwardly. Emily braced herself, flexing her knees to stabilize. She grabbed the top of the aisle seat, keeping her center of gravity low. She glanced at the cart she had nudged moments ago. It was now wedged strategically against the rear hijacker, restricting his movements. Perfect. A small victory, but she wasn't done. Emily's eyes flicked to the front of the cabin. The front hijacker was momentarily distracted, barking orders, but he had overestimated his control. He didn't realize that she had calculated exactly how long it would take him to react to the cart. Seconds mattered. Every misstep could be fatal. Her fingers brushed the metal panel of the service cart. She adjusted it slightly, just enough to force the rear hijacker's balance off by a fraction of a second. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but that fraction of a second was all she needed. She lunged forward, her motion smooth and controlled. Her elbow connected with the rear hijacker's shoulder, forcing him down further into the aisle carpet. He groaned, a mixture of pain and shock, but he wasn't finished. Emily pivoted, catching the gun as it skidded across the floor. Her training kicked in instinctively. Weapon control, leverage, timing. The front hijacker turned sharply, gun raised. Emily didn't hesitate. She moved fluidly, ducking and striking, twisting his wrist. The gun discharged, the sound deafening in the confined cabin. Sparks flew, seatbacks rattled, passengers screamed. And then silence. Emily had gained control, but only temporarily. She could see the fear flickering in the eyes of the remaining hijacker. They had trained for hostage control, for intimidation, but they hadn't trained for a decorated combat pilot disguised in a flight attendant's uniform. The cockpit voice crackled over the intercom, now panicked. What are you doing?" The sound of fear was unmistakable. Emily smiled faintly, keeping her exterior calm. "I'm taking control," she said softly, deliberately, allowing the words to echo through the cabin. "You should surrender." Another pause, then laughter, nervous and brittle. "You're a flight attendant. You don't even know how to." Emily cut him off. Her hand struck the gun from his grasp with precise force. "I've landed a burning jet on half a wing," she said, her voice calm but edged with authority. "And you're flying like an amateur." The front hijacker froze, a moment of hesitation that would cost him dearly. Emily's eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the terrified passengers, the remaining flight attendants, and the subtle openings created by the plane's violent maneuvers. Every second of hesitation, every miscalculation by the hijackers, amplified her advantage. She moved with precision, securing the rear hijacker against the cart and assessing the front hijacker's next move. Her mind raced. Control the weapons, stabilize the passengers, secure the cockpit. Each decision was instantaneous, each movement deliberate. Then the plane lurched again, a violent dive orchestrated from the compromised cockpit. Oxygen masks fell. Passengers screamed. Emily adjusted her stance, gripping the cart and bracing against the seat, her eyes never leaving the hijackers. Timing, patience, leverage, the three constants she relied upon in combat, were all she had. She counted silently. 1, 2, 3. The moment was near. The opening would appear and she would act decisively. Emily's voice rose slightly, firm and commanding. "Everyone stay calm. Do exactly as I say." The passengers froze, some obediently ducking, others staring in awe at the woman who had just neutralized armed men in their midst. The rear hijacker struggled, but the cart held him in place. The front hijacker's eyes flicked toward Emily, fear now mingling with disbelief. He hadn't anticipated her speed, her precision, her understanding of both human behavior and physics. He realized too late that the person in the flight attendant uniform was more dangerous than anyone aboard. Emily's hand hovered over the metal panel of the cart again, preparing for the next subtle adjustment, the next leverage point. Every micro-movement had been calculated, every reaction anticipated. The hijackers had underestimated her, and that underestimation was about to cost them everything. The plane tilted sharply again, turbulence threatening to topple anyone unprepared. Emily flexed her knees, braced herself, and whispered softly to herself, "Now, it begins." And in that moment, the balance of power aboard Flight 782 had irrevocably shifted. The cabin remained a hurricane of terror, screams mingling with the high-pitched whine of stressed metal. Flight 782 tilted sharply again, banking left and then right, as though the hijackers were attempting to disorient both passengers and crew. Oxygen masks swung violently in the turbulence, overhead bins rattled open, and the sharp scent of fear mingled with coffee and sweat. Emily Carter, however, remained unnervingly calm. Her body was grounded, her mind hyper-focused. She had navigated worse storms, worse threats. She had survived hostile skis where death was the only constant. She crouched slightly, bracing against the aisle seat, calculating every micro-movement. The rear hijacker was still pinned awkwardly against the service cart, groaning, disoriented, struggling to recover. The front hijacker, recovering from Emily's strikes in the previous aisle maneuvers, waved his weapon erratically, trying to reassert control. He had underestimated her, and that mistake had placed him on the defensive. Emily's eyes shifted toward the cockpit door. The reinforced barrier now seemed less like protection and more like a challenge she had been trained her entire life to face. She knew the layout from every cabin inspection she had conducted as a flight attendant, and every structural weakness of the door was already running through her mind. The locking mechanisms, the panel placements, the emergency override. The plane pitched again violently, sending a passenger tumbling into the aisle. Emily caught him with one hand, while maintaining her balance. She spoke firmly into the cabin, her voice a calm but commanding anchor amid chaos. "Everyone remain calm. Do not panic. Follow instructions." Her words carried authority. The passengers obeyed, not fully understanding why, but they trusted her implicitly, drawn to her presence, unaware of her military pedigree. Then she moved. With the precision of a seasoned pilot, Emily unbuckled from the jump seat, flexing her knees to stabilize herself against the cabin's violent tilts. Each movement was deliberate. Each step was measured. She edged closer to the cockpit door, her eyes scanning the hijackers for any sign of awareness. The rear hijacker attempted to lunge toward the aisle, but Emily's calculated footwork kept him off balance. Another slight nudge of the service cart forced him back into a corner. The front hijacker raised his gun, eyes wild, scanning for threats. Emily froze mid-step, letting him fully extend his attention toward her. Then, with a fluid motion born of years of reflex training, she ducked low, sidestepped his swing, and knocked the gun aside with a swift forearm strike. The weapon clattered to the floor, sliding across the aisle toward the rear hijacker. Sparks from the carpet flared briefly as panic rippled through the cabin. Emily pressed her advantage immediately. She drove her elbow into the front hijacker's ribs, forcing him back toward the seat row. He stumbled, momentarily disoriented, giving Emily the window she needed. Her eyes flicked to the cockpit door again, 15 feet ahead, reinforced, locked, but not invulnerable. She moved faster, every step precise, anticipating the plane's movements. Turbulence became part of her calculation rather than a threat. Each tilt, dive, and roll added momentum to her strikes. The rear hijacker, still struggling against the cart, finally regained partial balance and lunged at her. Emily pivoted, twisting his momentum against him. His body collided with the cart, sending him sprawling to the floor. A loud groan echoed through the cabin as he struggled, but Emily didn't pause. She had no time. The front hijacker had recovered partially, his weapon useless on the floor. Emily knew the only way to neutralize both threats fully was to reach the cockpit. The plane dipped suddenly, a sharp dive orchestrated from the cockpit. Passengers screamed, gripping armrests and loved ones. Emily crouched low, using the aisles and seat backs for stability, keeping her center of gravity low as she lunged toward the door. She reached the emergency panel, fingers brushing the buttons she had memorized during countless pre-flight drills. Her training as a combat pilot had honed these instincts. She could manipulate mechanical systems quickly, subtly, without alerting the hijackers to her intent. One slight press could disengage the primary lock for just a moment, enough for her to act. The front hijacker spotted her fingers on the panel. His eyes widened, realization dawning too late. Emily moved before he could react. A swift kick against his midsection sent him staggering back. He barely had time to recover before she struck again, knocking him into a seat frame. The gun discharged accidentally, a deafening bang that made passengers scream anew. Emily didn't falter. She pressed her advantage, rolling past the front hijacker and lunging toward the cockpit door. Her fingers found the manual override she had memorized. She pressed the sequence precisely. The lock disengaged for a fraction of a second. That fraction was enough. She shoved the door open partially, forcing herself into the narrow cockpit threshold. The hijacker in the front tried to stop her, but Emily grabbed his wrist mid-swing, twisting it violently, sending him sprawling backward. The gun clattered to the floor again, this time completely out of reach. Inside the cockpit, the hijacker at the controls reacted, attempting to jerk the yoke violently. Emily's eyes tracked the instruments instantly, altitude dropping, speed fluctuating dangerously, banking angles exceeding safety parameters. Every muscle memory from her combat flights, every calculation in emergency maneuvers, came alive in an instant. She struck, pushing the hijacker aside just enough to get a grip on the yoke. The plane lurched violently, alarms screaming, warning lights flashing. Emily adjusted the throttle, trimmed the wings, and stabilized the craft with surgical precision. The plane responded instantly, leveling out just enough to prevent catastrophic structural failure. The cockpit was a battlefield. Sweat ran down Emily's brow. Adrenaline surged through her veins, but her movements remained precise, controlled. She had wrestled aircraft from death before, had pulled jets from impossible dives, had stabilized crippled machines while keeping lives aboard intact. This, she realized, was different only in that the stakes were human lives in close quarters, not a metal frame hurtling through enemy skis. The remaining hijacker in the rear of the cabin banged on the cockpit door weakly, shouting, his confidence shattered. Emily ignored him, her focus entirely on the controls. She keyed the emergency frequency, broadcasting blind. "This is Flight 782, hostile cockpit. I have partial control of the aircraft." Silence answered her. Static crackled over the line, no acknowledgement. She exhaled slowly, steeling herself. The plane's altitude was low, fuel was beginning to read dangerously low, and the panic in the cabin was reaching its apex. She had secured the hijackers temporarily, but the fight was far from over. Emily's eyes scanned the horizon through the cockpit windows. Below, the mountains cut jagged lines across the landscape, clouds swirling like smoke. The plane was not over safe ground. Every adjustment had to be precise, every movement calculated. Failure could mean instant disaster. She steadied her hands on the yoke, flexed her fingers over the throttle, and whispered to herself, "This is what you were trained for. Stay calm. control everything. And in that moment, with the hijackers temporarily neutralized, passengers terrified but alive, and the plane teetering on the edge of disaster, Emily Carter became more than a flight attendant. She became the captain of chaos, the pilot of survival, the only barrier between life and catastrophe. She didn't celebrate. She didn't even breathe a full sigh of relief. Not yet. Because outside the cockpit in the cabin, her eyes could still see the hints of danger, the micro-movements of a man who refused to accept defeat. She had regained control, yes, but the battle was far from over. The plane pitched again, alarms screamed, passengers clutched each other, Emily's eyes narrowed. The fight for Flight 782 was just beginning. The cockpit smelled of sweat, fear, and the faint tang of jet fuel. The instruments blinked red, warning lights screaming louder than the alarms in the cabin behind her. Emily Carter's eyes darted over every dial, every gauge, every display. The plane had been pushed to its limits, tilted dangerously, banked aggressively, speed fluctuating beyond comfort. But her hands, trained on FA-18s, remembered instinctively how to stabilize a flying machine. Muscle memory wasn't just a tool. It was survival. The hijacker sprawled on the floor, groaning in frustration, tried to lunge at the controls, but Emily twisted slightly, using her leverage to pin his wrist. He flailed, but she held him with the calm certainty of someone who had faced far worse in enemy skis. Her eyes flicked to the yoke, one hand on the hijacker, the other on the controls. The plane lurched again, dipping sharply, sending alarms shrieking across the cockpit. Emily's mind compartmentalized the chaos. Turbulence. Ignore it, hijackers. Handle them, passengers. Stabilize. Flying a commercial airliner was different from her combat jets, yes, but physics was physics, instincts were instincts, and she had survived worse. She eased the throttle forward, trimmed the wings with surgical precision, and the plane responded, slowly leveling out. The cabin behind her would remain shaken, but alive. The rear hijacker was still pinned awkwardly against the cart outside the cockpit door, banging, shouting, trying to regain control. Emily glanced back briefly. His eyes flickered with desperation. He realized too late that the woman in uniform wasn't just a flight attendant. She was trained, experienced, and lethal in her calm. "Stop struggling," Emily said quietly, almost conversationally, though the edge in her voice betrayed a lethal warning. He froze for a moment, calculating, fear overtaking overconfidence. She turned her attention fully forward. The plane needed stability. Her fingers danced across the throttles, adjusting each engine with precision. Alarms stopped flashing one by one. The wings leveled. The violent tilts subsided. For the first time since the hijacking began, the aircraft felt like it was obeying her commands, responding with the obedience of a machine that trusted its pilot. Her eyes flicked to the instruments. Altitude still low, fuel dangerously limited, speed uneven. She had minutes, perhaps less, to think of the next move. The hijackers were contained for now, but she couldn't relax. Not yet. The cockpit intercom crackled again, a voice desperate and distant. "Flight 782, you need to land immediately. Military jets are scrambled. We're monitoring. Keep the passengers calm." Emily pressed the button, her own voice calm and commanding. "This is Captain Carter. Flight 782 is under control. We are stabilizing and preparing for emergency landing. Remain calm." The line went silent. Emily exhaled slowly, keeping her hands steady on the yoke. She had contacted authorities without alerting the hijackers. Timing was everything. Every second counted. She glanced at the front hijacker sprawled on the floor. He struggled again, a flash of desperation in his eyes. Emily knew she had to neutralize him completely before attempting any maneuvers that would require full concentration. One wrong move could reignite chaos in the cabin. Her eyes scanned the cockpit door. The lock had disengaged partially thanks to her earlier manipulations. One push could seal it fully, preventing the hijacker from interfering. But she needed him distracted. A subtle feint, she pushed the yoke slightly, mimicking a minor system adjustment. The hijacker instinctively reacted, reaching for the instruments. Emily's hand shot out. With the precision of a trained fighter pilot, she twisted his wrist, forcing him down. The gun slid across the floor again, now completely out of reach. The cabin behind her let out a collective sigh, muffled but palpable. She didn't turn to look. She couldn't afford even a glance. Every movement, every muscle in her body was engaged in keeping the plane airborne and controlled. Emily allowed herself a brief mental checklist. Passengers secured, hijackers contained, cockpit under control, aircraft stabilized, communications open. Everything was within her control. She had wrested the plane from chaos, but the mission wasn't over. Her mind flashed back to her combat missions, landing crippled jets on short carrier decks, managing failing hydraulics, pulling injured comrades from flaming cockpits. Each memory wasn't just a recollection, it was a tool. Each drill, each split-second decision honed over years, now applied in the most delicate scenario of her life. Emily adjusted the autopilot subtly, enough to maintain level flight while freeing a hand to move the hijackers further from the controls. She pivoted, using her elbow and shoulder to push the front hijacker against the side panel. He groaned, realizing full control was slipping further from his grasp. Her eyes flicked to the rear hijacker again. He had partially recovered, attempting to coordinate with his partner. Emily smiled faintly. Predictable. She had seen it in combat. Coordinated attacks fail when the leader is incapacitated. She was the leader now, the mastermind, and the plane was her battlefield. Emily's hand moved over the communication panel, contacting the tower discreetly. She gave precise coordinates, detailing altitude, speed, and fuel. The FAA scrambled assistance. Military jets had been dispatched, but Emily didn't need backup just yet. She needed one thing, to bring Flight 782 to safety while neutralizing the remaining threat. The hijackers had underestimated her. They hadn't calculated a decorated combat pilot disguised as a flight attendant walking among them, now in full control of their aircraft. And that miscalculation had cost them the initiative. Emily's fingers flexed over the controls again, stabilizing the plane fully. Every lurch ceased. Every alarm subsided. For the first time since takeoff, there was a sense of calm in the cockpit, controlled, calculated calm, emanating from the pilot who refused to panic. Her eyes scanned the horizon. Below, the mountains cut jagged lines across the terrain. Clouds swirled, sunlight glinting off icy peaks. The world was beautiful and deadly, and she was the only one keeping it from becoming catastrophic. She allowed herself a small, deliberate exhale. Not relief, there wasn't time for that, only focus, only control. Her eyes flicked to the hijackers one last time. Both pinned, disarmed, contained. Yet she knew their desperation could spark sudden violence. She had to maintain dominance, anticipation, and precision. One wrong step, one lapse in judgment, and everything could unravel. Emily Carter's hands, remembering the countless hours spent in cockpits under fire, worked almost independently. Every adjustment to throttle, rudder, and yoke was automatic yet deliberate. The plane leveled perfectly. Stability returned. Passengers, though still terrified, would live. And for the first time, she allowed herself a thought. She could land this plane safely. She could end this nightmare. But the hijackers, though contained, were still alive. And alive meant unpredictable. Alive meant danger. Alive meant vigilance. Her eyes narrowed, calculating, planning. This was no longer just survival. This was strategy, a test of skill, instinct, and nerves. Emily whispered to herself, almost inaudibly. "Let's finish this." Plane hummed under Emily Carter's command, a massive metal bird obedient to her every adjustment. The violent swings and dips of the earlier hijacking were gone, replaced by steady control, measured angles, and precise throttle adjustments. Passengers in the cabin clutched each other, some crying softly, others silent with awe. They had no idea that the calm figure navigating the aircraft through turbulence and terror was a decorated combat pilot, someone who had faced death countless times and walked away. Emily's eyes scanned the cockpit instruments like a hawk. Altitude, airspeed, fuel levels, navigation systems, all read stable. Yet the plane was still miles from safety. She needed to land, and she needed to do it without provoking the hijackers' last desperate moves. Her fingers danced over the yoke and throttle, each motion precise, each adjustment a fraction of a second difference between survival and disaster. The front hijacker, disoriented from Emily's earlier maneuvers, tried to rise, a glimmer of defiance in his eyes. Emily's gaze met his. One flicker, one twitch, and she acted. With a swift step, she pivoted, using her elbow and body weight to pin him firmly against the cockpit wall. The gun slid across the floor, completely out of reach. "Stop struggling," she said calmly, the weight of authority in her voice undeniable. His face paled, realization dawning. The person he had underestimated was in full command. The rear hijacker, pinned awkwardly against the galley cart, banged futilely, his confidence shredded. Emily ignored the noise, focusing instead on her approach to landing. She had just a narrow window of altitude, distance, and fuel. Every calculation had to be precise. One error and the aircraft, passengers, and crew could be lost in an instant. She glanced at the mountains through the cockpit window, the jagged terrain cutting sharp lines against the sky. Clouds swirled like smoke, casting shadows across the valleys below. The runway at the nearest airport was her target, distant but visible on the navigation display. The descent had to be slow, controlled, precise, accounting for wind, speed, and the lingering threat of hijacker interference. Emily exhaled slowly, centering herself. Muscle memory from countless carrier landings and emergency flights took over. She adjusted flaps, lowered the landing gear with precise timing, and trimmed the wings. The plane responded instantly, obedient and ready. She keyed the intercom softly, her voice calm but firm. "Passengers, please remain seated. Flight 782 is under control. We will be landing shortly. Remain calm and follow instructions." From the cabin came tentative murmurs, a mixture of disbelief and hope. Some began to whisper prayers, clutching loved ones, feeling the invisible hand of safety guiding them. Emily didn't let herself relax. Not yet. The plane descended steadily, slicing through turbulent air currents with surgical precision. Emily monitored every dial, every instrument, every subtle vibration. The hijackers had been contained for now, but desperation was dangerous. A single sudden move could undo everything. Suddenly, the front hijacker lunged again, trying to reach the emergency override panel. Emily reacted instantly, twisting his wrist, forcing him down. The gun skidded uselessly across the cockpit floor. Every move was calculated, precise, lethal if necessary, but always controlled. She had no desire to harm unless absolutely required. The rear hijacker, noticing the loss of control, started shouting, banging again, creating panic in the cabin. Emily spoke sharply into the intercom. "Remain calm. Do not interfere. Help is coming. Compliance is mandatory." Her words were authority incarnate. She could see the effect immediately. Passengers stayed low, listening, trusting. Every second counted now. Emily's mind worked faster than any computer. She calculated descent speed, approach angle, wind correction, distance to runway, and fuel consumption, all simultaneously. Her hands adjusted yoke and throttles with exacting precision. Each micro-adjustment ensured that the plane would touch down safely, even if the hijackers attempted a final desperate maneuver. She remembered her training, focus, anticipation, precision. Every emergency landing she had executed in military service flashed through her mind. She had landed crippled jets with failing hydraulics, piloted aircraft through storms with instruments dead, and survived hostile territory where mistakes meant death. Now, the stakes were human lives, multiplied, and her hands remembered exactly what to do. The cockpit door creaked slightly, the rear hijacker attempting a last-ditch effort. Emily's eyes snapped toward him. With a single fluid motion, she pivoted, using her shoulder and arm to press him firmly into the wall. His face contorted in frustration and fear. The front hijacker, sensing total loss of control, collapsed against the panel, breathing heavily, defeated. "Control is mine," Emily whispered under her breath, focusing on the approach. The runway approached quickly on the horizon. Turbulence buffeted the plane slightly, but Emily adjusted instantly. Flaps deployed fully, landing gear down and locked, throttle carefully moderated, instruments aligned, aircraft stable. Passengers gripped their seats, some gripping each other, others frozen in awe. No one realized that a decorated combat pilot, disguised as a flight attendant, had wrested full control from armed hijackers and was bringing the plane to safety under immense pressure. Emily's eyes flicked between instruments and runway. Speed, perfect. Altitude, correct. Angle, precise. She leaned slightly forward, flexing her wrists, recalling every touch, every vibration, every micro-adjustment she had learned in combat flights. Muscle memory guided her hands. Instincts guided her mind. She whispered quietly, more to herself than anyone else, "You've got this." The plane dipped slightly as it aligned perfectly with the runway. Emily eased back on the yoke, maintaining steady descent. The landing gear absorbed the first contact with the tarmac smoothly. Brakes deployed. Reverse thrust engaged. The aircraft shuddered, slowed, and came to a controlled stop. Silence fell across the cockpit for a brief, almost unreal moment. Outside, the world was still, the mountains cutting shadows in the late afternoon sun. Inside, Emily's hands remained on the controls, steady, prepared for any last-minute threat. She finally exhaled. The plane was secure. The passengers were safe. The hijackers, subdued and trapped, had no further leverage. A sudden cheer erupted from the cabin. Emily didn't turn immediately. Her eyes remained on the runway, on the aircraft, on the subtle vibrations in the fuselage. Only when the medical and security personnel approached did she finally relax slightly, allowing herself to step back from the controls. Her uniform was disheveled, sweat dampened her hair, and adrenaline still coursed through her veins, but she had done it. Every life on Flight 782 had survived. Every threat had been neutralized. And she had done it without firing a single shot at a passenger, without losing control, without yielding to panic. The hijackers were led away, shouting and protesting, but powerless against the authorities who had arrived in time to contain them. Passengers slowly realized the gravity of what had just happened. Some cried openly. Others hugged flight attendants. Children clung to parents, overwhelmed with relief. Emily Carter finally stood upright, taking a deep breath. She was tired, yes, physically and mentally, but the satisfaction of control, precision, and survival coursed through her. She had been trained for situations like this, and the years of military service, combat experience, and sheer instinct had carried her through. And as the passengers were escorted off the plane, some looking back with gratitude, awe, or disbelief, Emily allowed herself a small, private smile. She had done what no one expected. She had survived. She had protected. And she had landed Flight 782 safely. But she didn't celebrate. Not yet. Because she knew, somewhere in the chaos she had just endured, that survival wasn't just a victory, it was a responsibility. And Emily Carter had never been one to shy away from responsibility. The cabin of Flight 782 was a study in exhaustion, relief, and disbelief. Passengers clung to loved ones, their faces streaked with tears and sweat, hands trembling from adrenaline. The once terrified murmurs now gave way to soft sobs, whispered prayers, and tentative laughter. Emergency crews swarmed the tarmac, paramedics moving swiftly to assess anyone affected by shock or injury, while law enforcement officers escorted the subdued hijackers away. Emily Carter remained in the cockpit, breathing steadily but fully aware of the chaos outside. She had guided the plane, neutralized the threats, and kept every single life intact. Yet the adrenaline still coursed through her veins, her muscles tense, every nerve alert. Her mind refused to fully relax. After decades in combat, Emily knew survival demanded not just action but vigilance even after danger had passed. A young flight attendant approached, face pale but shining with awe. "Captain, I can't believe what just happened. You," her voice faltered. She didn't finish the sentence because no words could capture the magnitude of what had occurred. Emily allowed herself a small smile, her uniform damp with sweat and disheveled from the struggle. "It's over," she said softly, voice calm, almost soothing. "Everyone's safe." The flight attendants and remaining crew slowly moved through the cabin, checking on passengers, offering blankets, water, and comfort. Yet their eyes continually flicked toward Emily, sensing the authority she exuded, even without fully knowing her story. Something about her presence suggested competence, control, and courage beyond ordinary human experience. Outside the cockpit window, police cars and fire trucks flashed lights across the runway. Emergency teams moved efficiently, securing the area and preparing to guide passengers to safety. Emily finally stepped out of the cockpit, hands still trembling slightly from the stress, though her movements remained composed and deliberate. The first passengers emerged from the cabin, their faces etched with terror and gratitude. Children ran into their parents' arms, elderly couples clutched each other tightly, and strangers hugged each other as if the shared trauma bound them together. Murmurs of astonishment circulated. She saved us. She saved us." One man, visibly shaking, approached Emily cautiously. "Ma'am, I don't even know your name. You saved all our lives." His voice cracked. Emily's eyes met his. "I'm Emily," she said quietly. "That's all that matters right now. You're safe." Yet even as passengers began to recognize the reality of their survival, news crews began arriving. Cameras, microphones, and lights converged on the tarmac. Reporters shouted questions, trying to capture reactions, statements, and explanations. Emily remained calm, standing slightly apart, allowing her presence to convey authority without seeking attention. She didn't need to speak. Her actions had already told the story. A police officer approached, gesturing toward the subdued hijackers being led away in handcuffs. "Ma'am, we need a statement for the report. You single-handedly neutralized them and landed the plane." "That's," his words trailed off, awe overtaking professionalism. Emily nodded curtly. "Yes, but right now focus on the passengers, that's the priority." Her tone was firm but calm, commanding yet without ego. Meanwhile, passengers began murmuring to each other, speculating, whispering stories of the mysterious flight attendant, who had moved through the chaos with calm precision, guiding, protecting, and defending. Some had caught glimpses of the violent scuffles with the hijackers. Others had only sensed the unshakable calm that had kept them alive. The legend of Emily Carter began to take shape in their minds before the news crews could even report it. A young girl no older than 10 ran up to Emily, tears streaming down her cheeks. She clutched a stuffed animal to her chest and looked up with wide eyes. You saved me," she whispered. Emily knelt slightly, meeting the child's gaze. "Yes, and you're safe now," she said softly, adjusting the girl's hat and brushing hair from her face. "That's the most important thing." The girl hugged her tightly. Emily's heart clenched briefly, a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and the overwhelming responsibility of what she had just accomplished. She straightened, glancing at the airport perimeter where law enforcement now fully controlled the scene. The press, growing impatient, began shouting again, attempting to capture her attention. Cameras zoomed in, lights flashed, microphones thrust forward. Emily remained silent, refusing to speak beyond basic procedural acknowledgement. She was not seeking fame. She was not seeking accolades. Her satisfaction came silently in knowing every passenger would live, that every child, parent, and elder would see another sunset. A senior FBI agent approached, handing Emily a formal commendation folder. "Ma'am, On behalf of the United States, we recognize your extraordinary heroism and composure under extreme duress. Your actions prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss of life." Emily took the folder, her fingers brushing the embossed seal. She nodded respectfully. "Thank you," she said quietly, her eyes scanning the tarmac, ensuring that the final passengers were safe, that no further threat remained. She did not pause for applause, nor did she linger in recognition. Duty had been fulfilled. Meanwhile, the passengers began to slowly make their way to waiting buses and ambulances, many stopping to offer thanks, some in tears, some silently, their gratitude palpable in the simple nods and glances exchanged. Emily watched, keeping her stance firm, composed, yet humble. She had seen the aftermath of many dangerous missions in combat, where heroes were celebrated while others perished. Today, she was content to be unnoticed, her actions speaking louder than any words or headlines. The media persisted, cameras focused, reporters shouted questions. Emily finally addressed them in measured tones. "My responsibility was the safety of the passengers and crew. Everyone is alive, and that is what matters. I will not comment further until the investigation is complete." She did not elaborate. She did not boast. And yet, every passenger who had witnessed her actions understood fully what she had done. A silent hero, operating in the shadows of ordinary life, revealed only through her deeds. Later, as the passengers were escorted to safe areas and first responders tended to anyone in need, Emily stood to the side, watching the scene unfold. Her hands rested lightly on the cockpit door, now finally empty of threat. Her body relaxed slightly, though her mind remained alert. The hijackers had been subdued. The plane was safe. Lives had been saved. But the weight of responsibility lingered like a shadow. A child waved at her, shouting, "Thank you, flight attendant." The words carried across the tarmac, innocent and unfiltered. Emily waved back gently, a small smile playing across her lips. As the crowd dispersed, Emily's true identity remained largely unknown to the public. To most, she was the calm, composed flight attendant who had guided them through terror. To a few trained officials who recognized the precise skill, the unshakable calm, and the decisive movements, they knew she was something far greater, a decorated combat pilot, a warrior, a survivor. Yet Emily cared little for titles. Her satisfaction came from life preserved, from fear turned into relief, from chaos transformed into safety. She stepped away from the plane, glancing back once. The aircraft sat quietly on the tarmac, a vessel of survival and courage. Emily Carter allowed herself one final breath of relief, inhaling deeply, the cool air washing away the tension that had gripped her body for hours. And in that moment, she vanished into the shadows of heroism, recognized by some, unknown to many, but forever remembered by those whose lives she had saved. Her actions would ripple quietly, inspiring awe, gratitude, and reverence, but Emily did not seek recognition. She had survived, she had protected, and she had fulfilled her duty. Some heroes wear uniforms that everyone can see. Others wear the mask of ordinary life, revealing extraordinary courage only when the world demands it. And Emily Carter had just become a legend.